And APPA, I would venture to say, although I didn't double check this, but I would venture to say APPA has been part of all 16 of these forums in some capacity. So thank you for that long-term partnership with USEA as well. After 4 years away from APPA, I did spend 15 years of my career there prior to coming back. Some things do stay the same, and as I will list through many of the policy issues that we're focused on in 2020, many of those are familiar to me from 4 years ago. Few a little bit new or a little bit different, but mostly the same. Some things are different. I mean, I've aged 4 years, and yet my hair has gotten blonder, and my gray has miraculously disappeared. I don't know how that happened. So as I refamiliarize myself with the APPA issues, I hope you'll bear with me. I will answer as many questions as I can, but I also have Desmarie Waterhouse here, to help keep me straight if I do need some help. So thanks to her as well for being here. So do I have a clicker, or do I just say over here? Awesome. Okay. So this is just, we're going to talk a little bit about the policy issues, but hopefully we'll move public power forward as we get to the end. But first, I guess, again, in the spirit of refamiliarizing myself with public power and all of the issues that we cover, I'm going to take the opportunity to refamiliarize you all with public power, because we assume that everyone knows everything about the energy industry and the electric sector specifically. And when I came on to APPA, almost 20 years ago, and I came from Capitol Hill and I had worked on these issues, the level of complexity in this industry, just with the stakeholders alone, is daunting. So for those of you who may be a little bit new to the electric sector, I am going to just pause and take a moment and tell you who we are. I pulled this definition of public power from legislation, and you'll notice there is a typo. It's not my typo, but there is a typo. But this definition is even a little complex, but we can't get around it. We are utilities owned by political subdivisions of a state, such as a municipally owned electric utility, and a utility owned by any agency, authority, corporation, or instrumentality of one or more political subdivisions of a state. So what that means is we have formed over the last probably 40 or so years consortium of public power, of municipal utilities primarily, that get together and build their own generation facilities, handle transmission transactions, and participate in wholesale markets. They're typically called joint action agencies, so we want to capture them in the definition. We also do have, beyond municipal jurisdictions, we have a number of entities, irrigation districts in the West. We have an entity some of you all are familiar with called Salt River Project, which is a larger entity in the Phoenix area that actually provides electricity and water service. So some of these jurisdictions are not limited to municipalities. They're more look like a county level jurisdiction, or are just larger than a city or more rural in nature. So we're also not-for-profit, public, community-oriented, responsive. Our rates are governed locally, but we are subject to federal environmental, endangered species, reliability, critical infrastructure protection, regulation, and we have some limited federal regulation for public power transmission owners, known as FERC-Lite. Mostly, though, we are transmission dependent, meaning we are relying on other entities, other transmission owning entities to facilitate transmission service that we purchase. We also purchase more power than we produce. We do have generation facilities that we own and operate, or in some cases jointly own with others in the industry. But for the most part, we are purchasers of power rather than producers of power. Of the power that we produce, this is the breakdown. This is from 2017 EIA data. 42% natural gas, 26.6% coal, 18% hydropower, 6.5% nuclear, 4.8% oil, and 1.5% other, which is, we have actually a number of geothermal interests, particularly in California, 0.7% wind. All right. And then specifically to the American Public Power Association, who are our members? So there are actually 2,000 total public power utilities in the US. And that includes some of the territories. We have, of those 2,000, a little over 1,400 are our direct members, but we represent their interests holistically here in Washington. We have some very large utilities. Our largest, I believe, depending on how you slice it, is still Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So we have Orlando, Los Angeles, Seattle, Tacoma, San Antonio. Some of those larger cities are our members, but then we have most of our members, the vast majority, are very, very small. The median size of our utilities are 1,977 meters. Not very big. And then we have 14.4% of sales to ultimate electric customers. Okay. So what do we care about in federal policy for 2020? This makes me tired, coming from UTC where we had a more narrow focus, a hard focus because we were at the Federal Communications Commission, which, as Charla said, didn't care much about what we thought. But this is a longer list because APPA is what I call a full-service trade association. So we represent our members on the vast majority of public policy issues that could ever touch them when it comes to production of electricity. So there's a lot. And actually, when I started 20 years ago, it was in the middle of the Western electricity crisis, so there was a lot going on back then. But I would venture to say that the complexity of our industry has really increased exponentially even since then. And the list of the issues that we have to cover is kind of demonstrative of that. So just quickly, I'll tick through a couple of slides. We believed for a long time, and we still believe at APPA, that climate change policy in terms of legislation or regulation should be left to Congress. So Congress should actually weigh in, and then the Environmental Protection Agency should implement that policy rather than trying to reconfigure the existing Clean Air Act. So I will say that this is a really good number. From 2005 to 2017, which is the latest data available, public power utilities, of those generation facilities I mentioned earlier, we've reduced our CO2 emissions by 33% from 2005 levels. That's mostly the percentage of coal facilities that we used to generate from has definitely shifted. We also have a good story to tell on hydropower. We've done more run-of-the-river hydro and some innovative things on the hydropower front. We also, in order to achieve a more clean energy future and to address climate change, when the federal government is creating incentives for clean energy, or anything else for that matter, for electric vehicles, et cetera, oftentimes those incentives come in the form of tax incentives. Well, we're not for profit, so we don't pay federal income taxes. So how do we derive an incentive for our customers? So it's basically a parity issue, and whenever we see those types of incentives put forward, we want a comparable way, whether it be through a grant, whether it be through another type of tax mechanism that we could, a transferable credit, et cetera. And there are actually a number of bills pending right now that would provide such comparable incentives to us, and we've seen comparable incentives in law previously, and we have taken advantage of those. In terms of, this is another tax issue, a big one for us, in the tax bill that passed, was it in 2017 now? Wow. It feels like it was yesterday that tax bill passed, and it's already 2020. So when the big tax bill passed in 2017, we had a huge victory for public power and frankly for all local governments in that municipal bonds or tax-exempt financing was protected from taxation. There's a long history I could bore you with, which I'm not going to, but it's the primary financing tool for local government. And billions and billions and billions of dollars, $100 billion for electric facilities is pending, that's been developed through tax-exempt finance. So $100 billion of investments just recently for tax-exempt has been developed through tax-exempt financing. So a huge amount of investment has occurred through this tax mechanism or lack of tax mechanism. So we were very pleased that in that tax bill in 2017 that we weren't subject to taxation through tax-exempt financing, but there were some changes made to municipal bonds or tax-exempt bonds. One was our ability to basically refinance the bonds to get a better rate for the bonds on behalf of bondholders and on behalf of our costs. That's called refunding or advanced refunding of bonds. So we're seeking to reestablish that mechanism going forward. So we want to just make those more workable for us again, and it does save money for investors and for the projects themselves. Then on grid security and grid security funding, Public Power, along with the rest of the industry, and I speak for, I think, everyone in this room who's been involved in these issues, it's a huge focus for the industry to ensure that the grid is safe from physical and cybersecurity threats. As we all know, the reason we have a cybersecurity risk in the first place is because of what you heard from Charlotte earlier. We've layered digital communication technology on top of our grids to make them more efficient, to enable them to be more flexible, to have greater situational awareness, and to make them more reliable. That was a good thing, but unfortunately, the sort of yang of the yin has been that we have a cybersecurity risk we're going to have to manage now and into the future. So I think as Public Power, we have been a strong partner with the federal government as well as with our brethren, rural cooperatives and investor-owned utilities, in ensuring that we address this risk very, very seriously, and that we encourage our members to address it seriously as well. We have supported, in terms of the legislative front, there's a bill pending that would actually permanently fund activities related to grid security for electric utilities into the future through the Department of Energy, which is a great goal. We have, though, in the interim, been able to secure a couple of grants from the Department of Energy that APPA has been deploying to educate, particularly our smaller members, who may not be subject directly to bulk power system, electric reliability standards, and cybersecurity standards, but really to educate them on their cybersecurity maturity, and then also ways that they can protect themselves and manage this risk going forward. So it's been a great partnership. We also participate quite heavily in the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, which you may have heard about earlier from Jim Matheson or Tom Kuhn. That really is a forum for the electric sector and some electric sector CEOs to get together with our government colleagues. Sector coordinating councils were created for critical infrastructure sector entities after 9/11 to be able to partner with the federal government and really strategize about security matters. And as the cybersecurity issue has come more to the forefront, we've focused in a lot on that, but we still often talk about natural disasters, preparedness, and other physical security matters in those forums. But that's been a great partnership as well, and I think has really proven out when we look at the response, the storm response especially, in the last 10 years, I think you've seen an improvement in general with, maybe a couple of exceptions. We've seen a lot of improvement in Florida. The sector has worked very hard to harden itself, but also to work together to have mutual aid response and to really be prepared. Okay, so continued. This is the second slide. Again, it's a lengthy list, and it does make me a little tired, but I promise I'll get some sleep before we get really into this. This is only my 8th day on the job, so I'm not completely tired yet, but I'll get there, I'm sure. So the next bullet is, this is really more specific in some ways to public power and rural co-ops. We are the beneficiaries of, we pay for it, but we're sort of the priority beneficiaries of federal hydropower. So there are the big dams like Hoover Dam, they produce hydropower, we purchase it from the federal government and use it in our electric operations. So the power marketing administrations market that hydropower to us. Those entities are often under attack. They are paid for in total by rates. Taxpayers don't pay for them. Neither do taxpayers pay for the Tennessee Valley Authority, but it seems like with every administration, whether Democratic or Republican, there's a proposal to sell them off, to change them to market-based rates, and it's sort of a, it just doesn't make sense to us because there's nothing wrong here. It's really a solution in search of a problem, and we hope that every time it happens, we defend it. We work with the rural co-ops, and we beat it back, but every year it seems like there's something. So that's the case for the FY 2020 budget. There's some proposals that would seek to have these administrations and the Tennessee Valley Authority sell off their transmission, and that's something we oppose. Pole attachments, this is kind of back into the FCC realm. Similar, we work with UTC and our brethren on this, but there are some nuances in terms of how pole attachment policy is governed. And in the case of public power and rural co-ops, we are exempt from the FCC's pole attachment policies, thankfully. So we can manage that on our own at the local level. We are locally governed, as I mentioned earlier. And so the courts and the Congress have recognized that and understand that we're not for profit, and so we're really in it for the benefit of our customers. But there have been proposals, not the least of which from the FCC recently, that would undo that exemption through very Byzantine ways under the Organic Communications Act statute, and so we're pushing back on that. And there's a court case pending that we hopefully will win. Where we're calling into question new regulation in this regard. Back to what Charlotte was saying, though, about 5G and small cell deployment and how electric infrastructure being ripe for these small cells. And while I think we're in the same boat as others in the industry, that we appreciate that we're in a technology revolution and that 5G is appealing to many and that it should be embraced, it's really about balancing out that push with the reality of electric reliability. If you have a huge number of small cells on a pole, it weights the poles differently. That analysis has to be done. You cannot deploy any communications technology without electricity. So it makes sense for us to have these conversations now rather than later. You heard all about spectrum policy, so I'll just say that we're with UTC and the rest of the industry on that as well. In terms of electric vehicles, really, I mentioned it early, it's about funding, federal government funding, and also comparable incentives for us if there are tax incentives provided for our brethren to take advantage of in the investor-owned utility segment. We need to have those, but there are some other grants being made available and some legislation that's pending that we would support. But overall, I think we join the industry in recognizing that electric vehicles are coming and we want to be part of that solution in terms of providing charging stations ourselves and really integrating them into grid operations. On transmission policy, you heard that we're transmission dependent for the most part, so we really do need to have costs at the transmission level be reasonable, which is really what the law says. Unfortunately, sometimes we've seen some of the rulemakings coming through FERC or the proposals coming through FERC perhaps deviating from that reasonableness. And so we watch that very closely and we weigh in very heavily when we see proposals to increase transmission rates beyond what we consider reasonable rates. In terms of wholesale markets, this is kind of a downer one. This is one where, as many of you know, there's been a long debate about regional markets and their benefits versus their costs. We believe in many cases there's some benefits around being in a wholesale environment, but the costs have been very high in certain areas of the country. And then there has been this long-time plan in PJM. It's a pretty Byzantine issue, so I'm not going to try to explain it fully, but the way there's essentially a price floor in PJM for sales into the marketplace. And that proposal has been out there for a long time, and we've been concerned with it for a long time because we supply our own power. The generation that we do own and operate, typically we supply to ourselves on site, and we're using our own generation. And if we have excess, we sell it into the marketplace, but we're using it first for our own needs. And sometimes we don't have excess. Sometimes we're purchasing, right? So in this scenario, it's been a long time debated, and there's a proposal put forward by PJM around this minimum offer price rule or price floor, in which actually PJM said you should exempt public power utilities and co-ops from this MOPR, which is what this is known as, so that they can self-supply, right? And they shouldn't have to pay twice for generation. But unfortunately, FERC didn't listen to that recommendation from PJM itself and from many others, and instead swooped us into their recent order on PJM's MOPR. So we are going to be fighting that, and I think we just filed our rehearing request this week. So that's very unfortunate. It's going to be hugely problematic for us, so we'll continue to fight that, and it's disappointing. In terms of distributed energy resources and storage, we do highly support these technologies, and I want to say, in the vein of moving public power forward, really this is where it's at. I mean, I think electric utilities and public power specifically as community-owned entities really want to work with their communities on providing flexibility to customers around distributed energy resources, around renewable energy, clean energy. So we support these technologies. What we don't support is them being regulated, again, at the federal level. These are local and state issues, not federal issues. So we also have concerns with FERC's kind of reach into state and local decision-making. And we really believe any decision-making around these sets of issues, which are really distribution-level issues, that was very clear, and it's very clear in the Federal Power Act where those lie, that really states and localities need to be involved in any decision-making around distributed energy resources. So we have concerns about DERs participating in RTO markets, et cetera. Okay, so whew. One other thing I'll mention, oh my gosh. So that was it. The last thing I'll say is what's not listed here is wildfires. And it's kind of part of the vein of cybersecurity and resilience, et cetera. The sector is actually taking a look at that through this ESCC construct I mentioned earlier. We're having a meeting actually next week around this issue, and there has been a move for many years by electric utilities, including public power, to enhance our ability to manage vegetation, particularly on federal lands, but on our rights of way. And that has been blocked for many, many years. But we finally got legislation through, and regulation is pending. So we're just going to be encouraging the federal government to kind of get its act together and move forward with that regulation so that we can better manage our vegetation at minimum. But there's a lot to the fires issue, and I won't go into too much detail, but we are looking at that as well as a sector. All right, so really, bottom line is policies should incentivize public power utilities and other utilities to move into a future of greater communication and relationship with our customers. We already have great communication, but as we all know, the sector is changing. We need more flexibility. Utilities are going to be really seen as more of a service in the future. We want to be able to do that, and we want to be able to innovate. We've shown great innovation in the past. We've been movers and shakers in the industry when we're allowed to do that. But federal policy should not hinder us from making these decisions on behalf of our customers. So the positive example is what we talked about before on the cyber and physical security and the partnerships there with the federal government. It's key. They have the intel, they have a lot of the manpower we need to respond, but we have the infrastructure. The detrimental example would be the FERC decision I just talked about. So really want to be here to unleash the capabilities of public power, and we're here to maybe stop some bad ideas and promote good ideas as we move forward. So it's good to be home. Thank you so much.